Picture this: you've worked hard all your life, earned your success, and finally settled into a first-class seat on an overseas flight. The cabin smells of fresh linen, the glasses of champagne sparkle, and the menu promises luxury. You've pre-ordered your meal, just like every other time, confident everything is taken care of. But when the attendant arrives, something feels off. Instead of the elegant dish you were promised, she hands you a cold sandwich and a glass of water. Around you, other passengers are served caviar and lobster, their laughter filling the cabin. In that moment, a question pierces your mind. Was this really a mistake, or was it a choice? Now imagine you're the only black passenger in the room. Every dismissive word, every quick shrug suddenly feels like more than poor service. It feels like history repeating itself. What would you do? Stay silent and endure, or quietly take a stand that could change everything. This is the story of a man who turned one moment of quiet disrespect into a reckoning that transformed an entire airline. Like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. The soft glow of the terminal lights reflected off polished marble floors as Malcolm Hayes strode toward gate A23. To onlookers, he looked like any other seasoned business traveler, tailored navy suit, leather briefcase in hand. The quiet confidence of a man used to long hours and longer flights. But for those who knew his story, there was always more beneath the surface. At 52, Malcolm had built Hayes Global Solutions into one of the most respected logistics firms in North America. His calm voice had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. His steady hands had guided teams through economic storms that crushed competitors. And yet, despite all his success, the world had never let him forget one fact: he was a black man in spaces that weren't designed for him. The PA system announced boarding for Aurora Airlines Flight 1123 to Geneva. Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks, exhaled slowly, and walked toward the jet bridge. Geneva was where tomorrow's deal would close a merger that would secure his company's European expansion. It was the culmination of months of planning, and he intended to arrive prepared, focused, and well-rested. The moment he stepped into first class, the world seemed to change. Plush leather seats lined in neat rows, soft linen headrests embroidered with Aurora's silver emblem. The gentle scent of fresh upholstery mingled with the crisp bite of champagne already being poured. To most travelers, this was the definition of luxury. For Malcolm, it was familiar territory. He'd earned his place in these cabins long ago, though every time he crossed that threshold, a faint memory reminded him of the days when even walking into an airport lounge felt like trespassing. He slid into seat 1A, the corner spot he always preferred. It gave him room to work, to think, and to observe. Malcolm placed his briefcase under the seat, removed his tablet, and opened a document marked confidential. Spreadsheets of revenue projections filled the screen. He tapped a note for his assistant, Jared Lewis, who was already on a different flight preparing ground logistics. But beneath the numbers, his mind wandered. He remembered the times he'd been overlooked conference rooms where servers poured water for everyone but him. Bored dinners where the waiter placed the check in front of him as if assuming he couldn't possibly be the host. These weren't accidents. They were reminders, whispered in subtle tones. You don't quite belong here. And yet, here he was. Seat 1A. A flight attendant passed by, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet. She offered menus to the two men across the aisle, both white, both chatting loudly about market shares and golf tournaments. Malcolm knew their type. He'd sat across from men like them his whole career. He glanced at his own menu but hardly needed it. As always, he had pre-ordered his meal lobster bisque followed by a ribeye steak cooked medium rare. It wasn't about indulgence, it was about reliability. The comfort of knowing that after hours of work in the air, there would be something familiar, something that said, "You are valued here." The men across the aisle laughed, raising glasses of champagne poured before takeoff. One of them noticed Malcolm, gave a polite nod, and turned back to his conversation. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. But, for Malcolm, a flicker of unease stirred. He couldn't name it yet. Maybe it was the way the attendant's eyes skimmed past him. Maybe it was the subtle shift in tone when she greeted the other passengers. After decades of navigating corporate spaces, Malcolm had learned to read the smallest cues, the faintest signs of dismissal. He leaned back, adjusting his seat, and exhaled. Not tonight, he told himself. Tonight is about focus. Tomorrow is about the deal. The engines hummed a life, a low vibration running through the cabin as the plane prepared for takeoff. Outside, the runway lights stretched into the distance like stars guiding them forward. Inside, conversation softened as passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. Malcolm sipped from his water glass and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his daughter Camille, a law student who often reminded him not to carry the weight of the world alone. "You don't have to fight every battle." "Dad," she'd said once. He smiled faintly at the memory. Maybe she was right. Maybe tonight could just be a quiet flight across the Atlantic. But some stories don't wait for permission to begin. Because what should have been a routine trip, a glass of wine, a good meal, a few hours of sleep was about to shift, and the shift would not only test Malcolm's patience but ripple through Aurora Airlines in ways no one on board could have imagined. By the time Flight 1123 touched down in Geneva, every person on that aircraft, passengers, crew, and corporate leaders alike, would understand a truth Malcolm had carried his entire life: respect is not optional, it is the foundation. And it all began with a meal. Malcolm Hayes had always carried himself with a quiet dignity, the kind that wasn't loud or showy, but commanded attention nonetheless. People often said he had a presence, something about the way he entered a room, measured yet assured, as though the air itself acknowledged his arrival. But few understood how hard-earned that presence was, how much of it was forged from years of being told, in words and in silences, that he did not belong. He grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood where cracked sidewalks told stories of neglect and corner stores doubled as gathering spots for families stretched thin. His mother, Evelyn, worked double shifts as a nurse's aide. His father, Samuel, took whatever jobs came his way: mechanic, construction, delivery driver, never too proud to do what needed to be done. They didn't have much, but what they did have was discipline and hope, and they poured both into their only son. From an early age, Malcolm was taught that excellence wasn't a choice, it was survival. His parents knew the world would not meet him halfway, so they insisted he go further. If you walk into a room, you walk in prepared, his father used to say, because the second you slip, they'll say it's proof you never belonged in the first place. Those words stuck with Malcolm, echoing through classrooms where he was often the only black student, through basketball courts where his skill was acknowledged but his leadership questioned, through scholarship interviews where panelists smiled politely but asked him if he was sure this is the right fit. He carried those lessons through college at Howard University, where he studied business administration, then through Harvard for his MBA, where the weight of being the only one grew heavier. The stories he rarely shared were the ones that shaped him most professors who assumed his essays were plagiarized because they were too polished. Peers who asked if he was on a diversity scholarship. Recruiters who bypassed him for less qualified candidates because he might not fit the company culture. Every slight, every dismissal was etched into him, not as bitterness but as fuel. By the time he entered the corporate world, Malcolm had built a reservoir of patience that few could fathom. He rose quickly, not because doors were opened for him, but because he learned to build doors where none existed. His reputation became that of a man who didn't raise his voice, who didn't rush, but whose silence carried more weight than most people's anger. In boardrooms, he was often underestimated at first, but within minutes, his calm precision shifted the dynamic. He had a way of listening, really listening, that made people lean in. And when he finally spoke, his words landed with the gravity of someone who didn't waste them. When Malcolm founded Hayes Global Solutions in his early 40s, it was less about ambition and more about necessity. He had spent years watching companies crumble under poor leadership, watching talented people leave because no one valued them, watching industries talk about diversity in glossy brochures while excluding voices like his. He wanted to prove something different, that a company could be both profitable and principled, efficient and humane. Under his guidance, Hayes Global grew into a logistics powerhouse, known not only for its bottom line but for its culture of fairness. People stayed at Hayes Global because they felt seen, because Malcolm made sure no one sat in silence feeling invisible the way he once had. Despite all this, there were moments when the old wounds reopened. A dinner party where the waiter handed him the valet ticket instead of the host. A conference where someone assumed he was part of the catering staff. The sting never fully went away. He learned to mask it, to hold it beneath the surface. But each time it happened, he carried it with him, a reminder of the thin line between respect and dismissal. On Flight 1123, as he reclined in his seat, those memories flickered in the back of his mind. He thought of his daughter, Camille, who once confronted a professor after he dismissed her arguments in class, only to later use her points in a lecture. She had called Malcolm that night, angry and shaken. "It's like he couldn't imagine I came up with those ideas myself," she'd said. Malcolm had listened, his heart heavy, but instead of telling her to accept it, he encouraged her to keep pushing. "They'll try to shrink you," he had told her. "Don't you dare let them. Every time they doubt you, it's proof you're doing something right." He knew she carried those words into her law school lectures the way he carried his father's words into the boardroom. Malcolm's own battles had sharpened him but also softened him in unexpected ways. He learned empathy in places most people never look for it. He understood the janitor who cleaned offices late at night because his father once did. He respected the immigrant vendor selling hot dogs outside his office tower because he knew the grind of trying to make ends meet. His leadership wasn't just about strategy. It was about recognizing humanity in everyone. That was why people who worked for him described him not just as a CEO, but as someone who carried the weight of their trust. Still, there were nights he lay awake, replaying slights he couldn't quite shake. A colleague who once introduced him at a gala as a remarkable success story for his community, as if he were a charity case. A banker who spoke to his white junior associate as though he were the decision-maker. Malcolm never exploded in those moments, but each one chipped away at him. Each one whispered that no matter how high he climbed, Someone would try to place him lower, and yet he never let those whispers define him. Instead, he defined himself. He chose to lead with calm, to speak with clarity, to act with purpose. He wasn't naive. He knew racism wasn't going to vanish because he succeeded. But he believed in showing that success and integrity could coexist, that dignity was its own form of resistance. As the plane leveled into the night sky, Malcolm closed his tablet and stared out the window. Below, the Atlantic stretched into darkness, endless and quiet. He thought about the merger ahead, the negotiations, the lives that would be impacted by every clause of the contract. But he also thought about the flight itself, the tiny universe of first class, where respect was expected but not guaranteed. He had been here before, served with a smile that didn't reach the eyes, treated with a politeness that masked condescension. He wondered if tonight would be different. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe this would just be a flight like any other. Maybe tomorrow he could walk into the boardroom without the weight of insult or dismissal on his shoulders. But deep down, Malcolm knew better. The world had a way of reminding him, when he least expected it, that dignity was never freely given. It had to be claimed, protected, and, when necessary, demanded. And soon, on this very flight, he would be forced to demand it once more. The cabin of Aurora Airlines Flight 1123 settled into its rhythm as the fasten seatbelt sign flicked off. A low hum of conversation filled the air, mingling with the clinking of glasses and the soft shuffle of attendants preparing for service. Malcolm Hayes adjusted his seat slightly, stretching his legs, and allowed himself to absorb the atmosphere. First class was designed to exude calm, a curated tranquility meant to reassure its travelers that every detail was under control. It was, in many ways, a performance of luxury. But Malcolm had learned long ago that performances often concealed truths. He glanced down at the small card tucked into the seat pocket before him, a sleek menu printed on heavy paper stock, embossed with Aurora's logo in silver. His eyes skimmed the selections, though he knew what he had already chosen. Lobster bisque to start, a ribeye steak, medium rare, accompanied by roasted asparagus and mashed potatoes with truffle butter. He had placed the order days ago when confirming his itinerary, a small ritual that gave him a sense of predictability amid constant travel. For Malcolm, the pre-order wasn't about indulgence, it was about reassurance. A simple meal, prepared the way he requested, told him that his presence was expected and respected. Across the aisle, the two men he had noticed earlier were already leaning back with their jackets off, voices carrying as though they owned the air around them. One of them laughed loudly at a joke the other made, and a flight attendant appeared almost instantly, offering to refill their glasses with champagne. The gesture was warm, practiced, and immediate. Malcolm observed without judgment, only noting the difference. A younger attendant stopped at Malcolm's row, offering a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Good evening, sir. May I confirm your meal for tonight?" she asked. Malcolm's reply was even, measured. "Yes. Lobster bisque to start, ribeye steak, medium rare. I pre-ordered." The attendant nodded quickly, her gaze flickering past him almost before he finished speaking. "Of course," she said, then hurried down the aisle without further words. Malcolm leaned back into his seat. He had flown hundreds of times, thousands of miles. He had been treated with courtesy more often than not. And yet, every so often, something in the exchange felt different, colder, less attentive. Tonight, That faint unease stirred again. He pushed it down, reminding himself that assumptions could be dangerous. Still, his instincts had rarely been wrong. The meal service began with a delicate arrangement of hors d'oeuvres passed from tray to tray. Malcolm declined, preferring to wait for his soup. He watched as the men across the aisle were handed generous servings of caviar, their plates arranged with meticulous care. They bantered with the attendant, who lingered long enough to laugh at one of their jokes. Malcolm opened his tablet once more, pulling up a presentation he needed to finalize. Numbers and charts filled the screen, projected revenues for the merger. He tapped a few notes, highlighting potential risks. Business had a way of anchoring him. No matter the distractions around him, no matter the subtle slights, the numbers remained loyal. They told their story without bias. But his concentration wavered as another attendant walked past, arms laden with trays of steaming soup. The scent of rich broth filled the cabin. The passengers to his left received their bowls with appreciative murmurs. Malcolm closed his tablet, anticipating the moment his would arrive. It didn't. Instead, the attendant paused at his seat, her expression taut. She bent slightly, her voice low but not apologetic. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. We seem to be out of the lobster bisque. The only option available is a turkey sandwich." "Or a heartbeat?" Malcolm said nothing. He blinked, processing the words carefully. "Out," he repeated quietly. "I pre-ordered." The attendant's shrug was slight, almost dismissive. "It must not have gone through. It happens sometimes. I can bring you a sandwich and water." She didn't wait for his answer before moving on. Malcolm looked down at the space before him, empty where a carefully prepared meal should have been. His jaw tightened, but his face remained composed. Around him, other passengers were lifting spoons of bisque to their lips, savoring every bite. Across the aisle, champagne glasses clinked again, followed by laughter. He reached for the glass of water already on his tray and took a slow sip, the cool liquid offering no comfort. He thought about his father's words, about never slipping, never giving anyone an excuse. If he protested too sharply, what would they say? That he was overreacting, that he was difficult, that he didn't know his place. The sandwich arrived 10 minutes later, wrapped in plastic, the bread already beginning to sag. Malcolm unwrapped it slowly, setting it on the tray table. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked around the cabin, taking in the scene. 6 men, all white, dressed in suits not unlike his own, dining on the meals they had requested. He was the only one served differently. The only one offered less. Inside, a storm built quietly. He had endured moments like this before, smaller, sharper cuts that left no visible mark but drew blood all the same. But something about tonight, about the contrast between his expectations and reality, felt heavier. It wasn't simply about the soup. It was about what the soup represented: acknowledgement, equality, respect. Malcolm sat back, sandwich untouched, and let the silence fill him. He would not raise his voice. He would not draw attention. That had never been his way. But deep within, the decision began to crystallize. This would not pass unnoticed. Not tonight. Not anymore. As the flight continued, he folded his hands in his lap and closed his eyes briefly. Outwardly, he appeared calm, the picture of composure. Inside, he was already planning his next move. Respect, he thought, is never optional, And sometimes the quietest man in the room must remind everyone of that truth. The turkey sandwich sat untouched on Malcolm Hayes's tray, its plastic wrapper reflecting the dim cabin light. Around him, the first-class cabin carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. Bowls of lobster bisque were lifted delicately to eager mouths. Silverware clinked gently against porcelain. Laughter and conversation flowed easily across the aisle. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary evening flight gliding smoothly across the Atlantic. But for Malcolm, every detail of that moment burned into his mind with painful clarity. He lifted his glass of water again, studying the ripples that quivered along the surface with each small movement of the plane. The gesture was deliberate, a way to steady himself. Anger had always been an emotion he handled carefully, like a flame in his palm, capable of light, capable of destruction. He had learned to keep it contained, to let it fuel his resolve instead of consuming him. Tonight, however, he could feel that flame pressing harder against his skin. Kelly Marsh, the attendant who had delivered the disappointing news, returned moments later with a tray for the men across the aisle. She placed their ribeye steaks in front of them, each cut arranged neatly with asparagus spears and a drizzle of sauce that glistened under the lights. One of the men grinned, complimenting her service. She laughed softly, responding with warmth. The exchange was professional, even charming. And then, without so much as glancing at Malcolm, she moved on. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking closely. But Malcolm had spent his life noticing these moments. They weren't accidents. They weren't oversights. They were messages, wrapped in civility, coded in silence. You are not one of us. He thought again of his father's words. He could almost hear Samuel Hayes saying, "If you let them tell you who you are, you'll spend your whole life trying to prove them wrong. Don't play their game. Make them play yours." The sandwich remained in front of him, a symbol more than a meal. Malcolm finally unwrapped it, peeling the plastic back slowly, as though studying a piece of evidence. The bread was pale, the lettuce limp. He picked it up, took one small bite, then set it down again. The taste was as hollow as the gesture. A man, seated 2 rows ahead, caught Malcolm's eye briefly, offering a look that hovered between curiosity and pity. It lasted only a second before the man turned back to his own plate. Malcolm knew that expression well. People noticed injustice but rarely intervened, unwilling to disrupt their own comfort. It was easier to look away. As the meal service concluded, Kelly passed by once more, this time pausing briefly at Malcolm's row. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice polite but clipped. Malcolm looked up at her, his face unreadable. "I expected something different," he said quietly. Her smile was thin, perfunctory. "I'll see what else we can do next time," she replied before moving swiftly down the aisle. "Next time?" The words echoed in Malcolm's ears, laced with dismissal. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a way of brushing him aside, an assurance that his dissatisfaction was inconsequential. The rest of the cabin seemed oblivious. The men across the aisle continued their jovial discussion, one of them gesturing animatedly with his fork. A woman at the far end of the row sipped her wine, her gaze fixed on the in-flight entertainment. For them, this was just another flight. For Malcolm, it had become something else entirely, a reminder that no amount of success, no number of boardrooms commanded, no millions negotiated could shield him from the sting of being diminished. His tablet rested on his lap, the presentation glowing faintly on the screen. He tried to focus, to bury himself in numbers and projections, but the words blurred. Instead, his mind replayed every detail: the dismissive shrug, the lack of eye contact, the effortless way she had moved past him as if he were invisible. He closed the tablet, folded his hands together, and sat in silence. Jared Lewis's voice echoed faintly in his memory, though Jared wasn't here. "You shouldn't let them get away with this, Malcolm," Jared had said in another context, during a different slight months earlier. "You've worked too hard. You've built too much. Why should you let anyone treat you like less at the time?" Malcolm had responded with patience, because sometimes silence is strategy. He had said, but tonight, silence felt different. It didn't feel like strategy. It felt like complicity. As the dinner service wrapped up, the attendants dimmed the cabin lights, signaling the transition into the overnight portion of the flight. Blankets were distributed, pillows adjusted, window shades drawn, one by one. Passengers settled into their cocoons of comfort, preparing for hours of sleep. Malcolm, however, remained awake. He reclined slightly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above, the soft glow of overhead lights tracing faint shadows. His heart rate had slowed, but his mind was restless. Each slight he had ever endured seemed to converge in this moment, each one a reminder that dignity was never guaranteed. The truth crystallized in him with clarity sharper than any blade. This wasn't about a bowl of soup. It wasn't about a single flight. It was about something larger: patterns, systems, cultures that allowed small acts of disrespect to accumulate into something corrosive. Left unchecked, they grew, feeding on silence, thriving in the spaces where people looked away. Malcolm knew what came next. He would not raise his voice in the cabin. He would not demand a scene. That was not who he was. But action, quiet, deliberate, unshakable, was already stirring within him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a short message to Jared, who would be waiting in Geneva. The words were simple, precise, and final: initiate protocol, Flight 1123. Crew IDs needed as the message sent. Malcolm placed the phone face down on the tray table. He exhaled deeply, the quiet fury inside him settling into resolve. The sandwich still sat beside him, untouched after that first bite, growing stale in the recycled cabin air. He stared at it once more, then pushed it aside. The night sky stretched endlessly beyond the window, stars scattered like distant promises. The Atlantic lay beneath them, vast and silent. Inside the cabin, the hum of the engines lulled most passengers toward sleep. But Malcolm Hayes did not sleep. He was awake, alert, and waiting. He knew the hours ahead would carry more than turbulence. They would carry reckoning. The cabin lights dimmed further, leaving only the soft glow from reading lamps scattered like tiny beacons across the first-class section. Passengers adjusted their seats, some lowering them into beds, others pulling blankets to their shoulders. A hush fell over the cabin, punctuated only by the steady drone of engines and the occasional clink of a glass being set down. For most, this was the peaceful part of the flight. For Malcolm Hayes, it was the hour when silence pressed hardest against his chest. He sat motionless, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, the phone he had just used lying dark on the tray table. The message to Jared Lewis had been short, almost curt, but it had carried the weight of a decision he didn't make lightly. He stared at the faint reflection of his face in the window beside him. the Atlantic night stretching endlessly beyond. His expression revealed little, but inside his mind the battle raged. Anger was not unfamiliar to Malcolm. It had followed him all his life, an unwelcome shadow that rose whenever the world reminded him of his place in its eyes. Yet he had always believed in discipline. He had watched men lose everything because they let their fury define them, because they let righteous indignation turn into reckless choices. He had vowed never to be that man. His strength had always come from restraint, from knowing when to speak and when silence spoke louder. But tonight, silence no longer felt like strength. It felt like surrender. He replayed the moment again and again, the dismissive tone, the shrug, the casual way Kelly Marsh had offered him a sandwich as though it were sufficient. He thought about the way she had laughed with the men across the aisle, how her posture had softened for them, how her voice carried warmth that had been withheld from him. Each memory was a fresh spark against the tinder of his patience. A voice in him whispered, "You should have said something. You should have demanded better right there, in that moment." Another voice answered just as quickly. And what would that have accomplished? A scene, a headline. Another story twisted into the stereotype of the angry black man. The debate tore at him. On one side was a lifelong instinct to keep control, to choose dignity over confrontation. On the other was a growing certainty that dignity was being eroded by his very restraint. If he swallowed this, if he allowed it to pass as he had allowed so many slights before, wasn't he complicit in his own diminishment? He remembered Camille's voice, strong and unyielding. "Dad, sometimes you have to call it what it is. If you don't, they'll never stop." She was right. But Malcolm also knew the risks. He had built his entire career on being measured, calculated, strategic. Every move was deliberate, every word considered. It was why board members trusted him, why rivals respected him, why employees looked up to him. But that same carefulness sometimes felt like a cage, keeping him from expressing the raw hurt that throbbed beneath the surface. Malcolm lifted the sandwich again, staring at it as if it were an artifact. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of every boardroom where his contributions were ignored until repeated by someone else. It was every handshake that lingered too short, every polite smile that carried the weight of exclusion. It was the sum of decades of being told, in ways small and large, that his presence was conditional. He set it down once more, untouched. A low chuckle drifted from the men across the aisle. One of them called for more champagne, and Kelly returned promptly, her face bright, her tone engaging. Malcolm watched the interaction closely. She leaned toward them, laughed at their jokes, placed their glasses with precision. Then, without a glance in his direction, she turned away. The flame inside him flared higher. He inhaled deeply, forcing his shoulders to remain steady. This was the crucible, the moment when his discipline and his fury collided. He had a choice: explode and let the fire consume the room, or hold steady and let the fire guide him somewhere else, somewhere more decisive. His father's words came back once more. Don't play their game. Make them play yours. Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the memory settle into him. He saw his father coming home from work, grease still on his hands, exhaustion etched into his face, but pride in his eyes. He remembered the way Samuel had taught him to stand tall, not because the world would respect him, but because he needed to respect himself. Those lessons weren't about silence or outbursts. They were about intention. slowly. Malcolm's breathing steadied. The storm inside him didn't fade, it sharpened. His anger was no longer a raw flame threatening to burn him from within. It was a controlled fire, directed and purposeful. He had already set things in motion with Jared. Now, the question was not whether to act, but how far the action should go. For the first time since the exchange, Malcolm allowed himself to imagine the possibilities. He pictured Kelly and the rest of the crew being questioned, their records examined, every careless word and past complaint dragged into the light. He imagined Aurora Airlines being forced to reckon with patterns it had ignored for years. He imagined the men across the aisle realizing, too late, that they had witnessed something far larger than a missed meal. And yet, even as the thought brought a measure of satisfaction, another feeling rose within him: sadness. Because none of this had to happen. A simple acknowledgement, a genuine apology. Even the effort to make amends could have changed the course of the evening. Respect required so little. And yet, here he was, preparing to demand it with consequences far heavier than anyone on this plane anticipated. Malcolm opened his eyes and looked around the cabin once more. Most passengers were dozing now, lulled by the hum of the engines and the dimmed lights. Kelly walked quietly down the aisle, checking seat belts, adjusting blankets, her face composed. She didn't look at him. Perhaps she thought the matter was closed. Perhaps she believed he would simply accept the slight and move on. But Malcolm Hayes had decided otherwise. His phone buzzed softly against the tray table, a discreet vibration that told him Jared had already begun. He didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he folded his hands, sat back, and let the calm return to his face. Outwardly, he was just another passenger settling in for a long flight. Inwardly, he was a man preparing for a reckoning. The anger was still there, but now it was something else too. Resolve, sharpened into clarity. He would not raise his voice, he would not argue or plead. But by the time this plane landed in Geneva, Aurora Airlines would understand a truth as old as his father's lessons. Respect is not a favor to be granted. It is a right to be recognized. Malcolm Hayes closed his eyes once more, not to sleep, but to steel himself. Tomorrow would be about business. Tonight was about something greater. Tonight was about dignity. Malcolm Hayes opened his eyes again as the plane drifted steadily through the night. The Atlantic stretched below, invisible in the darkness, but he felt its presence, a vast expanse of water mirroring the weight in his chest. He had made the decision earlier when he sent the message to Jared Lewis. Yet decisions always carried a second phase, the quiet conviction to see them through. Tonight, that conviction settled over him like armor. He reached for his phone once more, not to check for distractions, but to reread Jared's confirmation. The message was simple. Understood. Beginning audit now. Jared was efficient, discreet, and loyal. Malcolm had chosen him not just for his skills, but for his integrity. When Jared handled a task, Malcolm never worried about loose ends. That trust mattered now more than ever. As he tucked the phone away again, he let his gaze drift to the aisle. Kelly Marsh was moving down the row with practiced efficiency, collecting empty glasses, adjusting blankets for passengers who had already fallen asleep. Her expression was professional, almost neutral. But Malcolm noticed the subtle difference in how she bent slightly closer to one passenger, how she lingered at another seat with a warmer smile. With him, there had been no such softness. She had dealt with him briskly, as if eager to move past. Malcolm didn't need to analyze it further. He had lived long enough to know when someone was choosing to overlook him. He shifted slightly in his seat, reaching for his tablet again. This time, he wasn't opening the merger documents. Instead, he opened a secure folder, one that contained protocols few outside his closest circle even knew existed. Hayes Global Solutions had systems for everything: contracts, logistics, security, and Malcolm had always insisted those systems include safeguards for the people who represented them. Respect wasn't just a moral value in his company. It was embedded in its operations. If partners, vendors, or even airlines dismissed his people, it was documented, reviewed, and escalated when necessary. Tonight, that same framework would apply here. He typed a few notes quietly, his fingers moving steadily across the screen. Each word was deliberate, each phrase meant for Jared's eyes only. He wasn't venting anger, he was recording evidence. He included the timing of the meal service, the precise wording Kelly had used, the way she had dismissed his protest. It wasn't dramatic, but it was methodical. Malcolm believed in facts as much as feelings. He wanted no one to argue later that this was just perception. Once he finished, he set the tablet aside and leaned back again. His face was calm, but inside him, he could feel the quiet firmness solidifying. This wasn't just about one flight. This was about every other black traveler who had been told in small, cutting ways that they were less deserving of courtesy. It was about setting a precedent, about proving that silence would no longer protect those who chose to diminish others. As the cabin remained hushed, he thought again of Camille. She would have told him not to wait, not to let the night slip by without action. He smiled faintly at the thought of her fiery determination, but his way was different. He knew the power of timing. He knew that sometimes, waiting until the world thought you had accepted defeat only made your eventual move more undeniable. A faint vibration on his phone signaled another message. Jared again, preliminary review shows pattern. Kelly Marsh, multiple complaints filed in past 3 years. Mostly dismissed, not isolated behavior. Malcolm's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression didn't change. The confirmation was both expected and disheartening. He had suspected this wasn't the first time, and now the evidence was clear. Aurora Airlines had known, or should have known, and yet the pattern had continued. This was no longer just an incident. It was systemic. He typed back a single response. Proceed, compile everything. Then he set the phone aside once more, letting his fingers rest against the armrest. A flight attendant, older, with gray streaks in his hair, passed by quietly, checking on passengers. He paused briefly at Malcolm's row, offering a polite nod. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" he asked. His voice carried none of the coldness Malcolm had felt earlier. It was simple, respectful, almost cautious. Malcolm studied him for a moment before replying. "No, thank you," he said evenly. Then, after a pause, he added, "Though I would appreciate some clarification." The attendant blinked, uncertain. "Clarification, sir, yes," Malcolm said. His voice was calm, steady, but firm enough to make the attendant's posture stiffen slightly. "Earlier, I was told certain meals were not available, yet I noticed others around me receiving them. I was also told something about prioritizing guests. I'd like to understand what that means." The man's eyes flickered with discomfort. He opened his mouth, closed it, then cleared his throat. I'm not sure, sir. Perhaps it was a miscommunication." Malcolm held his gaze, Not unkindly, but unflinchingly. "I see," he said at last. "That's all I needed." The attendant nodded quickly, murmured another "of course," and retreated down the aisle. Malcolm leaned back again, the conversation brief but telling. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. Yet the question had landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving outward unseen but unstoppable. He closed his eyes again, letting the calm wash over him. His decision was no longer in question. The quiet anger of earlier had sharpened into certainty. When the plane touched down, Aurora Airlines would confront its own reflection, not because Malcolm shouted, not because he demanded spectacle, but because he chose the harder path, deliberate accountability. Hours ticked by in silence, but Malcolm barely noticed. He drifted in and out of thought, replaying memories of past slights, envisioning the moment when the truth would finally be laid bare. The flame inside him no longer wavered. It was steady now, a controlled fire illuminating his resolve. Respect, he thought once more, is never optional. It must be expected. It must be enforced. And with that, he opened his eyes to the darkness outside, already picturing the dawn in Geneva, not just the sun rising over the Alps, but the light of consequence breaking through Aurora's polished facade. The cabin had settled into a fragile quiet. The engines hummed steadily, a constant reminder of the vast ocean beneath. Most of the passengers in first class had drifted into sleep, their seats reclined, their breathing slow and even. Malcolm Hayes remained awake, his eyes fixed on the faint reflection in the oval window. He could see the outline of his own face, calm on the surface, though his thoughts ran deeper than the Atlantic below. Another vibration stirred on the tray table. His phone lit briefly, casting a pale glow against the dark cabin. Jared Lewis's name appeared with a new message. "Malcolm, it's worse than I thought. Pulling more records. Multiple complaints not just against Kelly Marsh but also 2 other attendants currently on your flight. Similar patterns: dismissive service, biased language, preferential treatment, complaints filed, rarely escalated, many marked as unsubstantiated." Malcolm read slowly, each word sinking like a stone. He let the silence stretch, then scrolled down to the attached files Jared had compiled. Screenshots of complaint logs filled the screen dates, passenger statements, internal notes from Aurora Airlines. Words leapt out, phrases like "did not feel welcomed," "treated differently from others." Staff ignored request. Names and dates changed, but the story repeated again and again. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just one night or one attendant. It was a pattern woven through the airline's fabric, invisible to those who never had to notice, glaringly clear to those who lived its weight. Malcolm set the phone down and pressed his fingertips together, leaning forward slightly. His anger was no longer sharp. It had cooled into something heavier, steadier, a deep resolve that carried both sadness and clarity. He thought of the countless travelers who didn't have his resources, his position, his voice. How many had sat in these same seats, enduring the same dismissals, then left quietly, carrying the ache home with them because they felt they had no recourse. How many times had Aurora Airlines filed complaints away, confident no one with influence would press harder? He remembered a man he had once met in an airport lounge, a young engineer traveling to his first international conference. The man had confided nervously that he always felt out of place in spaces like these, that no matter how carefully he dressed, how politely he spoke, he felt invisible. Malcolm had encouraged him then, telling him his work would speak louder than prejudice. But now, staring at the evidence on his screen, Malcolm wondered how many times that engineer or people like him had been quietly cut down by moments like this. He picked up the phone again and typed a response to Jared. Document everything. Secure it. This is bigger than tonight. The reply came swiftly. Already done. Drafting report for immediate escalation. Do you want Aurora's executive team alerted before landing? Malcolm paused, considering. Timing mattered. Too soon, and it would become a scramble of denials. Too late, and it would lose its force. He tapped slowly. Prepare everything. Hold until my signal. Placing the phone down again. He let his gaze wander across the darkened cabin. Kelly Marsh moved quietly at the far end, checking on passengers, her steps measured, her face neutral. To the casual eye, she was simply doing her job. To Malcolm, she represented the surface of a deeper truth, the quiet ways prejudice could hide in professionalism, shielded by polite tones and corporate procedures. He exhaled, long and controlled. He wasn't angry at her alone anymore. She had played her part, yes, but the stage had been set long before she entered it. The real problem was the system that had allowed her behavior to blend into routine. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what his father would say if he were here. Samuel Hayes had faced discrimination in raw, unmasked forms, being turned away from restaurants, being paid less for the same work, being called names to his face. Malcolm's battles were different, subtle, dressed in suits and uniforms, hidden beneath layers of civility. But the wound was the same. His father had fought to carve space for dignity. Now Malcolm fought to protect that space from erosion. A memory surfaced of Evelyn Hayes, his mother, who once told him, "The hardest battles are the ones no one else sees, but you'll know, and that's enough reason to fight them." He felt her words now like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. The hum of the engines deepened slightly as the plane adjusted its course. A faint announcement from the cockpit broke the quiet, a reminder of expected landing time in Geneva. Passengers stirred slightly, some adjusting their blankets, others shifting in their seats. The illusion of tranquility remained. But for Malcolm, the calm only sharpened the contrast with what awaited once they touched ground. He lifted his tablet again, not to review his merger presentation, but to draft a note personal, not corporate. He began writing what he would say when the time came. Words that were not about numbers or contracts, but about respect. He wrote not just for himself, but for every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or diminished in spaces where dignity should have been unquestioned. His sentences were measured, deliberate, carrying the same weight he used in boardrooms but infused with something deeper truth. Minutes turned into an hour. The cabin remained hushed. Malcolm's note grew into a speech, not rehearsed but prepared, ready for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. His phone buzzed once more. Jared again, Malcolm, cross-referencing with external records. Aurora has settled at least 2 quiet discrimination complaints in the past year. Confidential agreements, sealed files, patterns match. This is systemic at the corporate level. Malcolm read it, then closed his eyes briefly. There it was, the final confirmation. What had begun with a missed meal was not coincidence. It was evidence of something larger, something long hidden but undeniable once exposed. He typed his last message for the night, understood. This ends tomorrow. Then he placed the phone away and folded his arms, his posture calm once more. To anyone watching, he was just another executive resting on a long flight. But inside, the resolve was absolute. Respect was not optional. And when the wheels touched down in Geneva, the mask Aurora Airlines had worn for years would crack wide open. The first glow of dawn began to edge over the horizon as Flight 1123 neared European airspace. The cabin remained dim, shades drawn, but faint traces of light seeped through, softening the dark interior. Malcolm Hayes adjusted slightly in his seat, rolling the stiffness from his shoulders. He hadn't slept. His mind had refused to rest, too occupied with the weight of the night's revelations and the certainty of what was to come. Around him, the other passengers stirred. Some stretched and rubbed their eyes, others called quietly for coffee or tea. The attendants moved through the aisles, their smiles polished, their movements smooth, as if the night had passed without disruption. For most, it had. For Malcolm, however, the silence had been anything but empty. Every hum of the engine, every glance at his phone, had carried him closer to a line he could no longer ignore. Kelly Marsh appeared again, her voice hushed but professional as she offered beverages. When she reached Malcolm's row, her words were the same. "Would you care for some coffee, sir?" The tone was neutral, almost rehearsed. She didn't linger, didn't meet his eyes for long. Malcolm considered her for a moment before answering. "No, thank you." His voice was steady, calm, but his gaze held hers long enough for her composure to falter. She moved on quickly, her back stiffening as she continued down the aisle. He let out a slow breath, then reached for his phone. A new set of files awaited him, Jared Lewis's final compilation before landing. The details were damning complaints, patterns, settlements all meticulously documented and organized. Jared had even flagged potential whistleblowers within the airline who had raised concerns only to be silenced. The report painted a picture not of a few isolated incidents, but of a culture quietly allowed to thrive behind corporate branding. Malcolm scrolled through page after page, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the breadth of it. Every complaint echoed his own experience in some form: ignored service, dismissive language, preferential treatment for others. He imagined the passengers who had written them, their frustration pouring into words, their hope that someone would listen. And yet, each entry had been stamped, filed, dismissed. His decision was no longer abstract. The tipping point had arrived. He would act not only for himself but for every name hidden in those records. A voice crackled over the intercom, breaking his concentration. The captain announced their descent into Geneva, reminding passengers to prepare for landing. Attendants moved briskly now, clearing trays, securing bins, checking belts. The mood shifted, that familiar mixture of anticipation and fatigue that always accompanied the end of a long flight. Malcolm set his phone aside and straightened in his seat. His pulse was steady, his breathing even, but his mind sharpened like a blade. He thought about the moment that would come once the plane touched ground, the confrontation, the exposure, the reckoning Aurora Airlines could no longer avoid. He had been preparing for moments like this his entire life, not this exact scenario, but the battle between silence and truth, between convenience and justice. Across the aisle, the men who had received their lobster bisque hours earlier joked lightly about their meetings in Zurich, unaware of the storm about to break around them. Malcolm studied them for a moment, not with envy, but with clarity. They moved in a world where respect was assumed, where courtesies were given without question. He did not resent them for it, but he knew their experience was not the universal one. His very presence in seat 1A was proof of the difference. Kelly passed once more, this time ensuring all passengers were ready for descent. She adjusted a blanket here, tucked a strap there, her demeanor brisk but controlled. When she reached Malcolm, she hesitated only a fraction before nodding curtly. "All set, sir?" she asked. Malcolm inclined his head slightly. "I am." She moved on, but he caught the faintest flicker of unease in her posture. Perhaps she sensed something in his tone, something beneath the calm surface. As the plane began its slow descent, the city lights of Geneva twinkled faintly below, scattered like jewels against the dark landscape. Malcolm felt a strange calm settle over him. The hardest part was no longer the decision itself, it was the waiting. The hours of silent anger, of debating whether to let it go, were behind him. Now, it was about execution. He thought again of Camille. He imagined telling her about this night, about the sandwich that became a symbol, about the decision that would ripple far beyond a single flight. He knew she would understand, perhaps better than anyone. She had inherited not only his resolve, but also the fire to speak when silence became unbearable. He smiled faintly at the thought. The landing gear extended with a heavy thud, shaking the cabin slightly. Passengers adjusted their seats upright, fastening belts. The attendants moved quickly now, their steps precise, their instructions firm. Malcolm followed the motions calmly, hands steady as he secured his belt. Outwardly, he was just another passenger preparing to land. Inwardly, he was the axis around which the flight's narrative would turn. The wheels met the runway with a shudder, the engines roaring as the plane slowed across the tarmac. A ripple of relief moved through the cabin. Another safe arrival. Another routine flight completed. For most, that was all this would be. For Malcolm, the moment of impact was not the landing itself, but what awaited beyond the gate. The intercom chimed once more, announcing their arrival. Passengers stirred, gathering belongings, stretching stiff muscles. Kelly and the other attendants moved briskly through the motions of farewell, thanking passengers with practiced smiles. Malcolm didn't move yet. He remained seated, hands resting lightly on the armrests, eyes calm but focused. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew what awaited outside Jared's presence. Executives alerted, human resources representatives standing by. Aurora Airlines believed this was just another flight ending. They had no idea it was the beginning of their reckoning. As the passengers around him reached for their luggage, Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself one final time. When he opened them again, the resolve in his gaze was unshakable. Respect was not optional, and in a matter of minutes, Aurora Airlines would learn that truth in ways they could not ignore. The cabin lights brightened as the plane rolled slowly toward the gate at Geneva International Airport. Passengers shifted impatiently, unbuckling belts and reaching for carry-ons before the final announcement permitted them. The attendants moved through their closing rituals with mechanical efficiency, smiles polite, voices measured, to anyone watching. Flight 1123 was ending like any other transatlantic trip. But, for Malcolm Hayes, this was the threshold moment he had been preparing for all night. He remained seated while others stood, his posture steady, his expression calm. He didn't need to rush. The true movement would begin once the door opened, and he intended to step into it with the same quiet authority that had carried him through decades of boardrooms. Around him, The murmurs of conversation rose the men across the aisle laughing about their golf trips, a woman discussing taxi arrangements with her seatmate, the ordinary chorus of travelers returning to their routines. Malcolm listened, but felt separate, as if seated in the eye of a storm only he could see. When the chime sounded and the front door opened, the usual flurry began. Attendants thanking passengers, people jostling slightly in the aisle, the impatient shuffle of feet eager for ground. Malcolm waited, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his eyes fixed on the door. He was not the first to leave. He wanted the moment to come to him, and it did. As the initial wave of passengers disembarked, two sharply dressed individuals in dark suits appeared at the entrance. They weren't attendants. Their posture and expressions gave them away immediately corporate representatives, waiting with purpose. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and an ID badge clipped discreetly to his lapel, scanned the cabin quickly before his gaze locked on Malcolm. His features tightened, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something he already knew. Malcolm rose then, unhurried, collecting his briefcase from beneath the seat. The sandwich still sat wrapped on the tray, forgotten and stale. He left it there, a symbol of everything that had led to this moment. Adjusting his jacket, he stepped into the aisle. The hum of conversation dulled slightly around him, passengers parting instinctively to let him through. At the doorway, the two executives waited. "Mr. Hayes," the silver-haired man said, his voice low. "Careful. If you'll come with us, please." Malcolm studied him for a brief moment before answering. Of course. His tone was even, almost courteous, but the weight beneath it left no room for misinterpretation. He stepped off the plane into the jet bridge, where the air felt cooler, sharper. Waiting at the end were several more figures, two representatives from Human Resources, a woman with a tablet already in hand, and another man whose expression carried the unease of someone bracing for fallout. Beyond them, Jared Lewis stood tall, a folder tucked under his arm, his eyes steady as they met Malcolm's. "Mr. Hayes." Jared greeted softly, inclining his head. No other words were necessary. The group moved together into a nearby conference room, hastily arranged in the terminal. The blinds were drawn, the space sterile, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead. On the table sat bottles of water and neatly stacked files. The HR woman gestured for Malcolm to sit, but he remained standing for a moment, placing his briefcase deliberately on the table before lowering himself into a chair. Jared took the seat beside him, sliding the folder closer. The silver-haired executive cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, we understand there were concerns raised during your flight. We want to assure you that Aurora Airlines takes all matters of service seriously." Malcolm let the words hang in the air before responding. His voice was calm, quiet, but each syllable carried weight. Concerns. That's an interesting word. What happened on Flight 1123 was not a matter of poor service. It was a matter of respect, or rather, the lack of it. The HR woman shifted uncomfortably, fingers tapping against her tablet. The silver-haired man started to speak again, but Jared interrupted, his tone clipped. "With respect, this isn't speculation. We've compiled records, complaints, and patterns across multiple years. What Mr. Hayes experienced is part of a systemic problem your company has ignored." He opened the folder, sliding a stack of documents across the table. Pages of complaint logs, settlement records, and internal notes lay exposed beneath the harsh lights. The executives leaned forward, scanning the details. Malcolm watched their faces carefully, the tightening jaws, the faint widening of eyes, the quick glances exchanged as they realized the scope of what was being laid before them. This is not about one attendant. Malcolm continued evenly. This is about a culture your company has allowed to grow. Dismissive service, discriminatory treatment, selective courtesy, you've silenced complaints, settled them quietly, and continued with business as usual. That ends today. His words landed with the force of a gavel, though his tone never rose above measured calm. The room fell silent for a long moment. The HR woman finally spoke, her voice soft. "Mr. Hayes, we will, of course, launch a full investigation. Immediate action will be taken with the staff involved." Malcolm held her gaze. An investigation is not enough. Accountability is not a gesture. It's a commitment. This isn't about punishing individual. It's about changing a system. I will not accept platitudes or empty apologies. I expect structural change. The silver-haired man swallowed hard, his composure faltering. "We understand. We'll need to review." No, Malcolm interrupted, his voice firmer now. "You don't need to review. You need to act. And you will. Because the evidence is here. Because silence is no longer an option. And because Aurora Airlines cannot afford to pretend it values luxury while failing to deliver the most basic dignity." The room absorbed his words in silence. Jared's presence beside him was steady, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. Finally, the HR woman nodded, her tone resigned but resolute. "You're right, Mr. Hayes. This goes beyond a single incident. We'll move immediately. The crew will be suspended pending review. Broader reforms will begin today." Malcolm leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. His satisfaction came not from their discomfort, but from the inevitability of truth breaking through. "Good," he said simply, "because respect is not optional, and I will ensure that's a lesson Aurora Airlines carries forward, not just in words, but in actions." The meeting ended shortly after. The executives gathering their papers, their faces tight with the realization that the reckoning had only just begun. As Malcolm rose, Jared handed him the folder once more. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Outside the room, the hum of the airport continued as if nothing had happened, travelers rushing to gates, announcements echoing over the intercom, luggage wheels clicking against tile. For them, this was just another morning. For Aurora Airlines, it was the beginning of a transformation it had long resisted. Malcolm Hayes walked calmly through the terminal, briefcase in hand, his stride measured but unyielding. To those who glanced at him, he was simply another executive arriving for business in Geneva. But within him, the truth burned steady. Respect had been demanded, and justice had begun its work. The same morning sun that bathed Geneva in pale gold fell harshly on the crew of Flight 1123. While passengers hurried off to connecting flights or meetings, the attendants were directed away from their usual routines. Instead of dispersing to hotels or preparing for their next assignments, they were quietly ushered into a conference room tucked behind security doors. The sudden detour set nerves on edge. Whispers flickered among them, questions whispered but unanswered. Kelly Marsh sat stiffly in her chair, arms folded tightly across her chest. She noticed the nervous glance exchanged by two of her colleagues, both attendants, who had laughed and chatted freely with passengers just hours earlier. The room's air felt heavy, as though everyone sensed what was about to happen, but no one wanted to give it words. Two HR representatives entered, accompanied by the silver-haired executive from earlier. His posture was rigid, his eyes scanning the crew without warmth. He placed a folder on the table, tapping it once before speaking. "You're here because Aurora Airlines has received serious complaints about conduct on Flight 1123. These are not isolated matters. Evidence suggests patterns of behavior that violate our standards, our policies, and our values." Kelly straightened slightly, her jaw tightening. "With all due respect," she began, her voice tinged with defensiveness. "This sounds exaggerated. There was a misunderstanding with a passenger, but we followed procedure." The HR woman cut in, her tone brisk. "This is not about a single misunderstanding. Records show multiple complaints spanning years. The same language, the same names. This morning, those records were placed directly before senior leadership." The words landed with a chill. Kelly's throat tightened. She glanced at her colleagues, but none of them met her eyes. The silence was damning. The silver-haired executive leaned forward. "Effective immediately. You are suspended pending a full investigation. You will not fly further routes until this matter is resolved." One of the younger attendants gasped softly, his composure breaking. Another shifted uncomfortably in her seat, lips pressed tightly together. Kelly, however, felt heat rising in her chest, anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. Suspended. For what? For doing my job. Her voice rose slightly, but the room's stillness absorbed it. The HR woman remained firm. "Your job is not only service, it is equal treatment, dignity, and respect. The reports show otherwise, and yesterday's actions confirm it." Kelly opened her mouth again, but the silver-haired executive lifted a hand, silencing her. "This conversation is over. You will receive official notice shortly. For now, you'll be escorted to accommodations while the investigation proceeds." A quiet knock sounded at the door, and two security officers stepped inside, their presence unspoken confirmation that the decision was final. The attendants shifted uneasily, the realities sinking in. Kelly's protest died in her throat. She could see the truth now. This wasn't a warning. This was the end of the road she had traveled too casually, believing her behavior would never bear consequence. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the terminal, Malcolm Hayes sat in a quiet lounge reserved for business travelers. Jared Lewis stood nearby, speaking in low tones with another Aurora representative who had been tasked with drafting the first official statement. Malcolm listened but said little. His role was not to manage their words for them, it was to ensure their actions matched those words. He sipped a glass of water slowly, watching sunlight scatter across the runway beyond the window. He thought about the crew gathered in that other room, about Kelly Marsh sitting rigid and defiant, about the realization beginning to settle over all of them. He didn't relish their downfall. He had never sought revenge. What he wanted, what he demanded, was accountability. And accountability always came with consequence. Jared returned to his side, placing a folder on the table. "It's done," he said quietly. "Suspensions issued. HR is drafting terms for broader review." Malcolm nodded once, acknowledging without celebration. "Good. But this isn't finished. This has to go higher. It has to reach the culture, not just the crew." Jared agreed. "The board will have no choice now. The documentation is too extensive. Settlements can't bury this anymore." For a moment, Malcolm allowed himself a breath of relief. The storm inside him had begun to quiet, not because the fight was over, but because the fight was finally visible. For years, People like Kelly had operated under the assumption that their actions would disappear into silence. Today, silence had been broken. In the crew conference room, Kelly sat frozen as the security officers guided her and her colleagues out in pairs. The walk through the terminal was humiliating uniforms that once signified authority, now marking them as subjects of scrutiny. Travelers glanced curiously, some whispering, others barely noticing. For Kelly, every step felt heavier. She thought about the years she had laughed with passengers like the men across the aisle, about the times she had dismissed others with a shrug, believing it harmless. She thought about how quickly the world had shifted beneath her feet. At the same time, news began to ripple quietly through Aurora's internal channels. An emergency bulletin notified staff of an incident on Flight 1123 requiring immediate review of service standards. It was carefully worded, avoiding details, but the implications were clear. Rumors spread faster than official statements. Within hours, employees across continents were whispering about a powerful passenger, about systemic bias, about a reckoning that had finally arrived. Back in the lounge, Malcolm rose slowly, straightening his jacket. He looked at Jared, his expression calm but resolute. This is just the first step. Now they'll have to decide what kind of company they want to be. Jared nodded, and they'll know you won't let them forget. As Malcolm walked toward the exit, he felt the weight of the night lift slightly from his shoulders. The anger that had burned so fiercely at 30,000 feet had been transformed not into vengeance, but into consequence, into change. He knew it wouldn't erase the wound, not for him, not for others who had endured similar moments, but it was a start. For Kelly Marsh and the crew of Flight 1123, the fallout had arrived swiftly, undeniably. For Aurora Airlines, the reckoning was only beginning. Aurora Airlines headquarters in Zurich rarely stirred before 9 o'clock. Executives arrived in sleek cars, coffee cups in hand, ready to review profit charts and operational reports. But on the morning after Flight 1123 landed in Geneva, the building vibrated with urgency before sunrise. Lights blazed across conference rooms, voices overlapped in hurried tones, and phones rang without pause. The incident had reached the top, and there was no pretending it could be contained. Inside the 21st floor boardroom, the company's senior leadership gathered. The CEO, Martin Vogel, sat at the head of the polished oak table. His eyes were shadowed from a sleepless night, and the lines on his forehead deepened as he scanned the documents laid before him. Across the table, the silver-haired executive from Geneva recounted the confrontation with Malcolm Hayes in detail. The HR director supplemented with files Jared Lewis had delivered, which were already circulating among board members. This isn't just one passenger complaint, the HR director said, her voice clipped. This is systemic. The records show a pattern of bias and dismissive service across multiple crews, multiple routes. In several cases, settlements were paid under confidentiality agreements, and now we have Mr. Hayes bringing it directly into the light. Martin Vogel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Malcolm Hayes is not just another passenger. He leads Hayes Global Industries. His influence extends far beyond aviation. If this becomes public, and it will, our reputation will shatter. The chief of communications spoke next, her voice tense. We have hours, maybe less, before this leaks. Social media is already alive with speculation. Crew suspensions are being whispered across staff networks. If we don't get ahead of this, we'll lose control of the narrative. The CFO interjected, his tone defensive. Let's not overreact. A public apology, suspension of the crew, some new training initiatives that should suffice. We've weathered complaints before. The HR director shook her head sharply. Not this time. The evidence is too detailed, too damning. Hayes has made it clear he will not accept platitudes. If we try to downplay this, he will expose everything. We're not dealing with someone who can be silenced. Silence fell. All eyes shifted back to Martin Vogel. He rubbed his temple, then finally said, "We need to decide now, do we protect ourselves with the usual measures? Or do we face this head-on and admit what we've allowed to fester?" The room grew heavy with the weight of the choice. Meanwhile, Malcolm Hayes had checked into his hotel in Geneva. The suite overlooked Lake Geneva, the water reflecting the soft morning light. He sat by the window, his briefcase open on the table beside him, though he wasn't reviewing merger notes. Jared Lewis stood near the desk, scrolling through his phone as updates poured in from Zurich. "They're scrambling," Jared reported. "The board met before dawn. Some want damage control. Others push for systemic change. Vogel hasn't decided yet." Malcolm listened quietly, sipping his coffee. He felt the calm of someone who had already played his move and now watched the board react. "They'll have to choose," he said softly, "but the choice is less about me and more about who they want to be. Luxury without dignity is a hollow promise." He turned his gaze back to the lake, reflective but resolute. "If they choose the easy route, I'll make sure the world knows. If they choose reform, maybe this airline has a future." By midday, the decision began to take shape. Vogel reconvened the board and spoke firmly. "We can no longer afford surface gestures. This goes to the core of our culture. If Aurora Airlines is to survive, it must transform. That begins today." He outlined a planned immediate suspension of the crew from Flight 1123, an independent investigation into systemic bias, mandatory equity and respect training for all staff, and the creation of a new oversight council with external advisors. Most significantly, he announced that Malcolm Hayes would be invited to serve as a consultant in shaping the reforms. The communications team crafted a draft statement. Aurora Airlines acknowledges systemic failures in ensuring dignity and equal treatment for all passengers. "We are committed to change, beginning with accountability and comprehensive reform. We thank Mr. Hayes for bringing these issues to our attention, and will work closely with him to ensure Aurora Airlines becomes a model of respect and equity." The draft circulated quickly, drawing gasps and protests from some board members. The CFO slammed his folder shut. "You're giving him the keys to dictate our future." "This is unprecedented." Vogel met his outrage with steady calm. "No, this is survival. Aurora's reputation is built on luxury. Without respect, that image crumbles. Hayes didn't humiliate us. We did this to ourselves. He's offering us a path forward, whether we like it or not." By evening, the statement was released publicly. Within minutes, it was trending across major platforms. Headlines framed it as both shocking and overdue. Aurora Airlines admits systemic failures. Passengers began sharing their own stories under hashtags that spread rapidly. Fly with respect. Seat 1A. The collective voice of those who had once felt silenced now roared with recognition. In his hotel room, Malcolm read the statement carefully. He didn't smile, didn't relax, but he nodded once. "It's a start," he said quietly to Jared. The phone rang minutes later. Martin Vogel's voice came across the line. measured but tinged with humility. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your patience. Aurora Airlines is prepared to take this seriously. I would like to invite you to join our Reform Council, to guide us as we change our culture." Malcolm considered for a moment before answering. "I'll join, but not as a shield for your reputation. I'll join only if you commit to real change. No shortcuts, no excuses." Vogel agreed. The line clicked off, and Malcolm sat back, exhaling slowly. He knew this was just the beginning. Reform was never quick, never easy. But he had opened a door that could not be closed again. Back at headquarters, resistance remained. Some executives fumed, others whispered doubts. But the tide had shifted. Employees, passengers, and the public were watching. Aurora Airlines had no choice but to step into the light. Malcolm gazed out once more at Lake Geneva, the water calm, reflecting the evening sky. In that reflection, he saw not only his own face but the faces of countless others, those who had been ignored, dismissed, overlooked. Their voices had joined his now, a chorus demanding something simple, something fundamental: respect. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a quiet indignity on Flight 1123 grew into a turning point for Aurora Airlines. The story spread across news outlets, blogs, and talk shows. Passengers from around the world came forward, sharing their own experiences of subtle disrespect and outright discrimination. For some, it was the first time they felt seen. For others, it was vindication after years of being told their complaints were exaggerated. Aurora's leadership, once reluctant, was now immersed in change. The Reform Council convened in Zurich with representatives from civil rights groups, diversity consultants, and employee advocates. At its center sat Malcolm Hayes, calm and composed, his presence a reminder of why the council existed in the first place. The first sessions were tense. Executives defended past practices, managers argued about logistics, and skeptics dismissed some proposals as too radical. But Malcolm listened patiently, speaking only when silence had run its course. When he finally addressed the room, his words carried the same quiet authority that had shifted the tide on Flight 1123. "This isn't about radical ideas," he said. "It's about dignity. A passenger who buys a ticket, any ticket, deserves respect. Not because of who they are, not because of what they can afford, but because they are human. If Aurora Airlines cannot embody that, then it doesn't deserve to call itself a leader in aviation." The room fell silent. Even the most resistant executives found themselves unable to look away. His voice was not loud, not angry, but its weight was undeniable. Changes followed. Training programs were redesigned, not as box check-in exercises but as immersive experiences rooted in empathy. Crew members were required to participate in role reversal scenarios, stepping into the shoes of passengers who had been ignored or dismissed. Policies were rewritten, complaints re-examined, and accountability woven into every level of the company. Most strikingly, Aurora introduced a new initiative called the Dignity Standard, a promise displayed on every ticket, every boarding pass, every lounge wall. It read simply, "Every passenger, every journey, equal respect." The transformation rippled outward. Other airlines took notice, pressured by the public and inspired by Aurora's bold shift. Articles praised the reforms as a blueprint for modern service culture. Hashtags like "Fly with Respect" continued to trend, fueled not just by outrage, but by stories of genuine change. Malcolm observed these developments with a measured calm. He had no illusions. Change was fragile, always at risk of being eroded by complacency. But he also knew that something fundamental had shifted. Silence was no longer possible. One evening, weeks after the council's work began, Malcolm returned home. His daughter Camille greeted him at the door, her eyes bright with curiosity. She had followed the story in the news, heard classmates talk about it, even watched clips of her father speaking at press conferences. "Dad," she said softly, "was it worth it? All of it?" Malcolm looked at her, seeing in her eyes both the innocence of youth and the burden of awareness she had inherited too soon. He crouched down slightly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Yes," he said firmly, "because it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who deserves to walk into a space and be treated with dignity. It was about making sure you never have to wonder if you belong." Camille nodded slowly, her small smile carrying more strength than her years suggested. "Then I'm proud of you," she whispered. Later that night, Malcolm sat alone in his study. The quiet hummed around him, different from the hum of engines at 30,000 feet, but just as steady. He thought back to that moment on Flight 1123, the sandwich, the dismissive tone, the sting of being reduced to invisibility. He realized now that the true victory was not in the suspensions or the policies, but in the transformation of pain into purpose. He picked up a pen and began to write, not a report this time, not a speech, but a reflection. He wrote about dignity, about the quiet ways it is denied and the powerful ways it can be restored. He wrote about his father's struggles, his mother's wisdom, and his daughter's pride. He wrote with the hope that someday others would read and understand that respect was not a luxury, not an add-on, but the foundation of every human interaction. In Zurich, Aurora Airlines unveiled a plaque in its headquarters lobby. It bore the words, "All seats earned, all faces welcome." The simple phrase became a symbol of the company's rebirth, a daily reminder to employees and passengers alike. Malcolm attended the ceremony quietly, standing at the edge of the crowd. He didn't seek recognition. The work spoke for itself. As he left the building, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes, do you believe Aurora Airlines has truly changed?" Malcolm paused, considering his response. His gaze drifted to the plaque behind him, then to the employees milling about, their conversations marked with a new awareness. "Change isn't proven in statements," he said finally. "It's proven in actions, day after day. Time will tell, but today, at least, respect has a seat on every flight." The reporter nodded, lowering the microphone. Malcolm walked on, his steps unhurried, his expression calm. He knew the journey was far from over, but he also knew this much dignity had been claimed, and once claimed, it could not be returned to silence. And somewhere, in the hum of an aircraft preparing for takeoff, in the quiet shuffle of passengers boarding, in the simple act of an attendant meeting a traveler's eyes with respect, the new standard was already taking root. The story of Malcolm Hayes is more than an account of an airline scandal. It is a reminder that dignity is never optional. Many of us have experienced moments of being overlooked, dismissed, or treated as if we were less than others. For older generations especially, these memories can run deep, being passed over for promotions, ignored in conversations, or treated with less respect despite years of hard work. What Malcolm teaches us is that we don't always need to fight with anger or loud voices. Sometimes, the most powerful response is calm, deliberate action that demands accountability. He shows that one person's decision to stand firm can ripple outward, forcing entire systems to change. The lesson we can carry into our own lives is simple yet profound. Do not let small acts of disrespect convince you that your worth is small, whether in family, community, or workplace. Respect is non-negotiable. And when we stand up not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us, we ensure that dignity becomes a standard, not a privilege. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like these remind us that respect and justice matter in every corner of life. If this story moved you, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful stories that inspire change and hope.